Something that to me that my faith offers me is the ability for reverence and wonder.
Mm.
That gratitude, the wonder that's full of gratitude, like thank you for making this world. Wow. Like if you
Hmm.
don't, if nobody made it, there's nobody to be thankful to.
Hmm.
And to wonder in that way of gratitude at the being who created that. I think that's a special thing that we can do in our
Hmm.
poetry. And yeah, to have that feeling of utter gratitude and reverence
Right.
um, is there as a gift.
Hello, everyone. This is Solum Literary Press. I'm your host, Riley Bounds, and this is the Solum Podcast, where we discuss and examine the intersection of the modern renaissances in evangelical literature, philosophy, and spiritual formation. Today, I'm excited to have Lesley Clinton on the podcast. Lesley Clinton is a writer, editor, and high school English teacher. Her chapbook of poems, Calling the Garden from the Grave, published through Finishing Line Press, placed second among books of creative verse in the National Federation of Press Women 2021 Communications Contest. In 2019, Clinton received the Lucille Johnson Clark Memorial Award from Houston Poetry Fest. Her poetry and book reviews have appeared in publications such as America, Think, Mezzo Canon, The Windhover, Presence Journal, Ecstasis Magazine, Reform Journal, Christianity and Literature, and Texas Poetry Calendar. In addition to teaching and writing, Clinton serves as a board member of Catholic Literary Arts and is editor-in-chief of the Chronicle of Strake Jesuit College Preparatory. She has an MA in teaching from Grand Canyon University and is pursuing an MFA in creative writing at the University of St. Thomas. Visit her at leslieclinton.com. That's Lesley Clinton.com. More information will be given in the show notes, including links to her social media if you want to find out more. So, Lesley, welcome, and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Riley.
All righty. Well, why don't you just tell us a bit about yourself?
All right. Well, so I started writing poetry really before I can remember. I know the earliest memory I have of writing is in maybe kindergarten. It was a story that I wrote, not a poem. It's prose.
Mhm.
And I remember in elementary school, my mother sending out a poem that I wrote for school to a journal that published children's work, and it got published, and I was so excited. But as much as my parents filled the house with literature and we were a reading household, I really don't remember any books of poetry that were my favorite or a whole lot of poems that I memorized when I was younger. So it's a little bit mysterious to me. And I kind of like that, that
Mhm.
it
Mhm.
in the background of my memory. And I don't know, but I do remember writing. And I know that by high school, I was writing quite a bit on my own, creating poetry. And I'd kind of stay up late. I would write Star Wars fan fiction and also poems into the wee hours. I was a nerd, but so I know that it was something that was always in me, just this
Mhm.
desire to write. And so by college, when I had figured out that I wanted to be an English major, I worked on the literary magazine editorial team, and I submitted work there.
Mhm.
Um, and really, once I graduated from college and had started working as a teacher, a few years into motherhood, when I had our children were babies, that's when I started writing in earnest. I
Mhm.
felt a stronger calling at that time to develop my craft, and so that's where I started, and it was during a hiatus from full-time teaching. So when we
Mhm.
talk
Mhm.
about the creative space that that artists need to create, I think about that a lot. I think about that a lot
Mhm.
because I think that we have a lot of responsibilities in our lives, and sometimes we're called to put aside things we love to attend to those responsibilities. And then other times we're meant to struggle to make room for something. But there was this time period where I was working part-time and editing and tutoring and whatnot. I wasn't in the full-time classroom. And that is where I really started sending things out. So there was something about having that little bit of extra time that got me going in my
Mhm.
writing career.
Yeah, it's interesting that your like shift to poetry kind of coincided with your becoming a mother. What do you think? Maybe is there a correlation there, you think, between like, well, creating life and creating poetry?
I would not be surprised at all. A lot of my poetry came out of that process of becoming a mother and all the struggles and challenges and joys that come with it.
Mhm.
And part of it is that, new mothers have so little time that we write in the nooks and crannies. And so to create something as short as a haiku is realistic, whereas something longer seems impossible. And I wonder if that had something to do with it as well,
Mhm.
that I turned to writing in shorter forms. I really wanted to work on short form poems when I started because I tend to be verbose, and my writing when I was younger was very wordy. And
Mhm.
I had
Mhm.
when I wrote, kind of business writing and articles, I had to learn to pare it down, make it more concise and clear. And when I wrote poetry, I said, I want to write really short form poetry to see if I can do it. And then
Mhm.
I had to kind of push back the other way, because then my poetry became very spare and I didn't want to be limited to that kind of voice either. So I've been
Mhm.
working on giving a little more breathing room to my poetic voice in recent years.
Yeah. It seems like kind of a rite of passage that young writers have to like be verbose and just use words that are completely unnecessary. And then you grow up a little bit and it becomes a little bit more full bodied. So
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I think that's yeah, natural. Well, what do you think it is that draws you to poetry in particular?
Um, you know, I think people write poetry because they feel compelled from deep within to do so. I think there's some urge deep within, some calling. I think it's a calling, but um, there's St. John Paul II wrote a letter to artists,
Mhm.
and he talks about what the artists do, what our role is, what that calling is about. And he says that we sense in our work some mystery of the creation. And he says, with which God, the sole creator of all things, has wished in some way to associate us, wished us to be able to associate with that mystery of creation. And so for me, writing poetry is participating in the mystery of creation. And that
Mhm.
I get to marvel at the wonders of the universe, of the seen and the unseen world. I get to know myself and my creator more deeply. I think poetry is a way to connect and heal and serve and build and praise and thank and honor and seek and find all of these things. As an educator in a Jesuit school, I'm formed in the Ignatian spiritual tradition. So that's the Saint Ignatius of Loyola's spiritual teachings, and he talks about finding God in all things. And so we practice the kind of this spiritual art of looking for God in all situations. Where was God in our day? We reflect on that quite a bit. Where do we see God? Where are we being offered comfort and consolation? Um, and uh, and so I think poetry is a way of seeing. It's opening our eye to that spiritual dimension
Mhm.
in the mundane world, and uh, and so it's a way of searching for God in all things.
Yeah. It's odd too. Like you're talking about just like exploring the mysteries of the universe, and you have this kind of theme that I've noticed with cosmology that seems to be coming up again and again with your work, and that's actually something that another Catholic poet, Laura Reese Hogan, she kind of focuses on that as well. Uh, so am I right in kind of seeing that, and is that correct?
Yes, that's astute. And yes, it is. It's true. And I've written a review of her amazing book, Litany of Flights. The review is in Christianity and Literature. And I think one reason that we were drawn to one another as creative, as poets, is this, well, she has a very contemplative I think Caritas, or I'm sorry, charism. She has a very contemplative charism, and I'm really drawn to that. I think it's beautiful. But
Mhm.
part of that is that, she sees things in their grandiosity, and then kind of she also gets that macro lens and gets really close up to things, and she's looking for the wonder of God in um,
Mhm.
all those ways. And I try to do that too. And so that's really neat that you notice that connection.
Yeah, and it's what's interesting about it is that your voices, even though you hone in on certain like common themes, your
Mhm.
voices are actually very quite different.
Mhm.
Um, and we'll talk a little more about your artistic voice in a little while here, but I did want to ask how long it just took you to cultivate the poetic voice that you currently use.
Till now, how old am I? 42 years.
Uh,
And it's a work in progress, but as an adolescent, my work was more sentimental and
mhm,
dreamlike. And in college, it took on more of a confessional tone. Even when the speaker was not myself, I dramatize things all the time. And, people always assume the speaker is the poet. The speaker's not always the poet, but it was
mhm,
that still had that confessional experiential tone. And early adulthood, I kept the kind of experiential aspect, or voice. Um, and then in recent years, I have started to exert a little more control over my
mhm,
authorial voice and discipline myself a little bit more to have some distance. Um, I part of what I'm doing to hone my craft is I'm pursuing an MFA at the University of St. Thomas, and I
mhm.
think there has been a lot of beneficial influence on my poetic voice from my work there, and part of it has been the control, uh, to kind of distance. So it's not about me; it's about the world around me, and
Mhm.
I want to step back as much as possible, to
Right.
allow the things to speak for themselves, and then the characters that I create. So that's a way of, again, stepping outside of myself and letting poetry be a listening act rather than a speaking act.
Right.
Ironic.
Yeah, it's so it's interesting that like as you progressed into your poetic career, you kind of took a step back, and it became less about confessions and less about you being the personal narrator as you like stepping back and observing something as maybe an impersonal kind of omniscient narrator. Do you think do you think this kind of naturally comes with time and age and just writing, or is it something like particularly for you? Is it something particular to you?
That's such a great question, and I think it's probably a mix. I
Mm,
think some of it is age, and I think that just happens naturally a little bit. And I think it's okay to work out things through poetry when you are younger, and to speak from your own perspective. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
mhm,
Or even when you're older, you do that as well. But so there's something about, so an author that I am just amazed by all the time is Sigrid Undset, who wrote Kristin Lavransdatter. She's not a poet, she's a novelist, a
mhm,
Norwegian novelist. And we studied her work in the MFA program, and we looked at the control that she exerts over herself as a narrator, and how she really, really presents things without letting how the narrator feels about them quite often, and the effect is really stunning. It's amazing. And so I'm inspired by that, and I
mhm.
want that as well. To
Yeah,
some.
yeah, very cool. Well, you mentioned the influence of your peers in the MFA program on your poetic voice, but besides them, like who are your like main poetic influences?
So if I think back, because we become influenced starting when we're young, when we're children. If I think
Mhm,
back to childhood, I remember this. I was at a friend's house. I would go over to my friend's house, and her mom had a Maya Angelou poem, "Phenomenal Woman," on the refrigerator.
mm,
And and I never forgot that poem. Why is that in my memory? Why do I see it on the fridge and remember it and remember lines from it? There's something there. And I think that the arresting voice that the poet has, which is ironic that I'm saying that, because we're just talking about how kind of controlled and pulled back my work has been often, but I really was inspired by the strength of the poetic voice in that poem, and also the use of detail, spare but powerful detail. So that's something that's rattling around right in my
Right.
head, in my mind. And then sixth grade, my friend and I had to memorize Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's "The Tide Rises, the Tide Falls"
Oh
for
no.
class, and we had to recite it. And we can still call each other on the phone and start, the tide rises, the tide falls, the twilight darkens, the curlew calls, and start laughing and reciting it. We never forgot it. But I came across a conversation on Twitter one time about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and they were kind of disparaging toward him and his work, and saying that it wasn't very serious. And somebody was standing up for him, defending his honor as a poet. And I thought, he stuck with me all these years. That poem, the narrative, the mystery, the rhyme, and the meter, the form, stuck with me. So I think there was something very powerful in his work as well, and I think that he deserves more respect. So
Yeah.
I stand up for his work as well. I think that it shaped me somehow, and maybe made me open to formal verse in a way that I might not have been otherwise.
Right.
In high school, I remember "Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night" and Dunstan Thomas. And I remember coming across an Yvonne Boland poem that really enchanted me. And in college, I was struck by the moderns, T.S. Eliot, Wallace Stevens, and the lyrical prose of Virginia Woolf. I know it's not poetry, but her prose is very lyrical. And then when I started teaching English, I started to fall in love with ancient epic poetry, and which I had liked in high school, but I really didn't understand it as poetry until
Yeah.
I began teaching it. And then when I started teaching, I discovered poets like Claude McKay and Lee Young Lee and Seamus Heaney and Robert Frost. Well, I knew of Robert Frost, but I don't think I understood the layers until I started teaching. And Cassiopeia A, who writes poetry, not just novels, and Liesl Mueller, who wrote one of my all-time favorite poems. So there's a bunch.
Yeah.
for you.
Yeah, no, healthy mix. It's so odd that you say that, that you began to fall in love with epic poetry when you started teaching it. Actually, I started teaching Beowulf to eighth grade, just like a month ago. And I mean, I fell in love with it. And I was just like, man, this is so awesome. And Seamus Heaney does such an amazing job of translating it.
Yes.
So it was like, yeah, it's I feel kind of like a con man for not knowing anything about it before I started teaching it. But I guess that's just the way teaching works.
That is the way teaching works.
Yeah.
And that's why Tolkien was so inspired by by so much of that old work, the
Right.
Anglo-Saxon poetry, because it's amazing.
It is. Yeah. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about your formal verse tendencies as we get more into your work proper. But for now, why don't you just tell us when did Christianity become an influence on your poetry?
So I think consciously it was when I started writing in earnest, in my young adulthood, once I was a mother. And I had already been a teacher for a while. I left full-time teaching for a while when my children were young. And so I had already been sort of formed in the Ignatian spiritual tradition as an educator. And I went to the University of St. Thomas, so for my undergrad, and I'm back there for my MFA now. But so there were things that had kind of influenced me. So by young adulthood, I had these kind of spiritual yearnings that I wanted to influence my work with these things, but I certainly didn't know how. I was lucky enough to find a great mentor in the writer Sarah Cortez,
Mhm.
who, and I serve on the board of Catholic Literary Arts, which is the nonprofit that she founded.
Mhm.
And she has a very sharp editorial eye, a very meaningful vision of a writer's calling. And she has a delightful performance demeanor. She was inspired by a great poet that she knows not to hide her faith from the writing community, no matter
Mhm.
how out of vogue it may be, because there are centuries of Christian poetry that form this rich literary treasure trove. And what a beautiful thing to be part of. And so she helped open my eyes to that possibility, because when I started writing, I felt I wanted to offer my writing as a gift,
Mhm.
but I realized that most publications, at least the ones that I knew of at the time, didn't want anything to do with a poet of faith.
Mhm.
I thought that I would either have to become a strictly devotional writer and write, obviously devotional poetry, and that was the only kind of poetry I wrote and published there, and other kinds of writing, or I would have to just not talk about God or include anything, and not openly embrace my faith if I wanted to publish. And that's really a false dichotomy. And I was thankful to discover that. I
Mhm.
was limiting myself. There are plenty of readers, plenty of publishers who don't dismiss the work of writers who have a Christian worldview.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, and I've said it before, I'll say it again. When I started Solum, I was so illiterate when it came to this stuff that I thought that Solum would be the only one on the scene, like doing what we're doing, like promoting Christian themed work. And then I jumped in and I realized, oh wow, I was sorely mistaken. Yeah, I mean, there's just a bevy of outlets out there that are like academically respected as well, namely Presence. I mean, that's a huge player. And then of course I just learned about yours. You're the editor in chief of the college preparatory, right?
well, mine is, yes, and mine is more for, it's our alumni magazine for our, but it's still editorial experience, which I'm very happy to have. But you
Mhm.
know who is Dappled Things is
Right.
doing cool things, and there are so many. There are so many. I've been published at Reform Journal, and um uh I think Radiant is another one, Grotto Network. So they're
Mhm.
just, yes, they're a bevy, like you said, so
Yeah.
many. And I remember those early days of sharing with my little group of writers, our kind of Catholic Poetry Society group. We had workshop together, and we would eat banana bread at Sarah Cortez's house, and
Mhm.
workshop poems and talk about where are we going to publish these poems. And there were, we'd find a few, and it was like there were so many more out there. We were just discovering how many there were. So it's really wonderful.
Well, just generally, do you think that Christianity can lend itself to poetry in a way that competing worldviews like agnosticism or atheism can't?
I have a good quote for that, if you don't
Okay,
mind.
go ahead.
Answer that
Yeah.
with somebody else's words. Um, there's a writer named Joel Clarkson who wrote in Word on Fire uh, that this was an article about writing in times of crisis.
Mm.
And the reason I found this article is that I was looking for something to talk about my chapbook, and because it does talk about suffering, and some of the characters are in states of suffering,
Mhm.
and so I wanted to be able to articulate why I think there's still hope in that. And so this is the quote I found that I just really answers this question I had really well. God has never ceased his creative mending of the world, which becomes most potent precisely when we feel things have most completely gone wrong.
Mm.
It is in the silence of uncertainty that Christians in the creative arts might most uniquely show the consoling love that enters into the voids in our lives and fills them with life, light, form, color, and music.
Mm.
There it is. I, that's the answer to
Uh,
your question right there. I just think it's so beautifully said.
mhm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it seems that God forms a groundwork in which we can stand on for beauty that maybe others that lack a metaphysical foundation like that can't.
Something that to me that my faith offers me is the ability for reverence and wonder.
Mm.
That the wonder that's full of gratitude, like, thank you for making this world. Wow. Like, if you don't, if nobody made it, there's nobody to be thankful to. and and to wonder in that way of gratitude that at the being who created that. I think that's a special thing that we can do in our poetry. And then and yeah, to have that feeling of utter gratitude and reverence
Right.
is there is a gift.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you see that too of other theistic poetry. Well, poetry from theistic faiths like Islam. You see a lot of that, the reverence crossing over into something like that as well. Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your chapbook, Calling the Garden from the Grave?
All right. So I wrote this book. This chapbook provides mosaic of reflections on spiritual endurance. The garden springing up from the grave site symbolizes, you could say, the workings of grace on the world, the miraculous life that manifests when we accept and fulfill our God-given callings with hope and with gratitude. And so if we were talking about a theme of the book, I would say that the theme is that spiritual endurance arises from dauntless hope, and it's manifest in our living out of our mission, or in our trust in God's miraculous power to make all things new, even when all seems lost.
Okay. What about the title?
The title is the springing up of life where it seemed like in a place of death, so it's a resurrection, kind of nodding to the resurrection. Right. And the book is split into two parts, and the first part is like a restless calling in my arms. It's called that. It's a line from one of the poems, but it's about the restlessness we feel from our callings. God is calling us towards something. And then the second half, Undying Fire, is the dauntless courage and hope that we need to pursue those callings. And not all of the speakers or characters in that second half, or even in the first one, do actually answer the callings. Like, they don't all choose hope, but they're all grappling with it. So it's, you get to see the whole gambit. It's like there are the ones who choose hope, or who are in a hopeless situation, and what do I do? And so it's a reflection meditation on that.
Okay. Yeah. So you alluded to the resurrection with the title, and that would obviously have a hopeful tone to it. At face value, when I first saw it, I was like, I wonder if this is supposed to be hopeful, or if it's supposed to be kind of a dark take on this. Because I mean, obviously, it's the Garden of Eden. Well, I'm assuming it's the Garden of Eden that we're calling to from the grave, and that would mean that we're dead. So I was just I was wondering if there was kind of an intentional paradox there, or how would you explain it?
I love that. You put that perfectly. And I think that's where some of the characters in the poems are. They're still in the grave, and they've chosen to stay there, or they're not courageous enough to take that leap, or to discern their callings and follow them, and all of that. Just so we're looking at both choices in the book. And so I wanted there to be, I want the grave in the title. The suffering needs to be there.
Yeah.
Suffering has to be there. We're not shying away from that. But, we have that, the way to the cross is through the suffering. We understand suffering differently in the Christian faith. And that's where we walk with Jesus. So there's something, a mysterious, miraculous journey in suffering. So we certainly don't want to cut it out of our work.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Shy away from it.
Yeah, no, that's another reason I really like your work is that it's very thoroughly Christian. I mean, it makes no bones about that. But it's so grounded in reality. It effectively crosses from natural reality into the supernatural, and that it's that bridge. And I mean, I really enjoy that you can like operate in both spheres, and um it's not just so quick to get to the glory that it shuns what we deal with on earth. So yeah. Well, just what led you to write Calling the Garden in the first place?
Those poems were in me. They wanted to get out, and they wanted to be written. So they, despite I really didn't have a writing community when I started. This is before I had found my writing community, and so it was kind of a lonely endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
Just in the little nooks and crannies when I had a little bit of time, I would start typing, and I really I didn't have like mentorship or anything. So I really feel like these poems were just telling me that, they needed to be, I was led to them. I found them, I discovered them. And so I began to pull them together for a manuscript a little bit later after I'd had some publishing success with individual poems. I started to have a collection, and I was looking at them and going, what have I been writing about? What have I been writing about? And then I was able to sort of write more once I realized that I had a thematic idea going, and I had a story to tell through this mosaic approach. Then I started putting them together for manuscript, and I saw that Finishing Line Press had a contest. So I entered the contest, and I didn't win it, but I did receive an invitation to, or an offer of a contract. And okay, and so then I had to go through the process of discerning whether, okay, is this meant to happen and meant to be, and researching, and then saying, yes, it is. I think it's meant to be. This book is meant to be published. So that's kind of how it came about.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting that like you didn't set out really to write a poetry book. You set out to write poems, but then you look back on it and you were like, well, what is this about? And then you figured out that this is a book. That's actually I've seen other writers do that, where they just write and then they look back on it. It's like, hey, I have written a book, So yeah.
And not everything went in. There were pieces, there were poems that I had written that didn't go into the manuscript because they didn't work towards that mosaic that I was creating. But and I don't know if I will always do it that way. I think probably my next book will be a little bit more well, I don't know. I say that, but I'm writing things all the time. So maybe not, I'm not as prolific as other writers, because I have 3 kids, and and a very, very
and teaching.
Teaching and editing that magazine and everything. So so I'm not as prolific as others, and I don't know, but I am creating things all the time that I don't think, oh, I'm making this for a manuscript. I'm just making poems. So I'm thinking that it'll be a little bit more focused from the beginning, but I can't say that for sure, because it's sort of in the works, but not really yet. So
yeah, I mean, I think it's similar between writers and musicians, where like their first album, I mean, you have your whole life to write that, and then the next one, the second one, is probably going to be like 6 months or so. So I mean, it has to be like more focused, thematically concise and stuff like that. So maybe there's some crossover there. But so now going more into your writing in depth, we talked a little bit about the impersonal narration that some of your poems have, where you take a step back and the narrator seems to see everything from a distance and is able to read the thoughts of others. And well, for example, in the Cassiopeia A, circa 1690, the poem that we published in Solum Journal, Spring 22, the narrator is actually far back in time enough and space to observe not only a supernova, but the people that are observing the supernova, which is pretty remarkable. And then another example is going to be that impersonal omniscient narrator in The Cathedral Sees Morning, which is the capstone of Calling the Garden, wherein the narrator muses on the formation of the cathedral and what is seen throughout its existence. So all I have to say, whereas most poets kind of incline toward narrating their poems personally from their own personal perspective, you seem to kind of take a step back and you observe the events from a distance. So what do you think is motivating that poetic distance exactly?
I think it comes back to that we talked about earlier, where writing is doing what it's meant to do, I think, most powerfully when it draws us outside of ourselves. And so I've been trying to, how have I heard this said, the phrase, tune my ear to the divine music a little bit more, listen more. And so that I'm getting outside of my own little imaginary fiefdom when I write. And I think that with that poem of Cassiopeia, it provided, there was this opportunity to have different time periods, because again, the stars are burning for so long, we can go back and past and somebody could be looking at the same star. So I had a really great time crafting that work and drawing back the eye, the kind of narrator's eye, and looking over a long period of time, and then looking at the universals. What are the timeless aspects? What are the universals? And then taking some of the, kind of the mythological background of Cassiopeia with the historical and then the kind of the scientific, what is a supernova. And so it was fun to fuse all of those elements together. And I really just wanted to get out of the way of all those wonderful threads and let them do work.
Yeah, no, I like that you deal more with objective things than just your subjective experience, because when we do that, I mean, it kind of, well, it's our own private reality. It's reality, but I mean, it's private, and it can speak to others, but there is a certain threshold where it's like it has to be universal enough for people to apprehend it, and it has to also deal with some kind of truth, not just your own personal what's true about you, but what's true about us all as people. And I mean, I like that you focus more on that than you do just your own what's relevant to you in your life. Now, another thing that you do that is a little bit well, unorthodox, as orthodoxy goes today, is that you write in formal styles. So in his review, which is a great review, by the way, J.D. Graham notes in his review of Calling the Garden that you use poetic form to exploit meaning in the poem's content. So, for example, he highlights Graceless, which is in Calling the Garden. The subject there is a diver, and she breaks her form in midair. So concurrently, you break your form of iambic tetrameter down to some form of trimeter, which breaks the rules that you set. So first off, just what inclines you to write in a formal style? And is it kind of easier for you, or is it harder for you to write in these formal styles than in free verse?
So I think that the craftsmanship of form provides a structure and boundaries that I have found increasingly beneficial over the years. And if we're talking about which one is harder, verse is definitely harder.
Yeah.
Writing in meter is definitely harder. You can never ever get stuck in free verse as badly as you can get stuck in a metered poem when you're missing the right word for that. You need, the syllable count and whatnot. And And I think there's something wonderful about that. It's so, oh gosh, when you're stuck and you cannot get out the way that you planned on getting out, and you have to find another way. If you
Mhm.
want, if you want to maintain that meter, if you think it's important enough in that line to maintain it, then you are forced to take a different approach. So that, again, remember, I've been talking about being pulled outside of ourselves and how important that is.
Mhm.
And I think meter is another tool for that, drawing us
Mhm.
outside of ourselves. And so you have to come up with a solution that you didn't want. The parameters are external. And you basically, you're giving up some control to this ideal form, and then you work towards it and you make it come to life with that iteration, your unique manifested iteration, in it, as only you can do, as only the poet in that moment can do, right? So you're working with something timeless, with a form, and then you're bringing your uniqueness to it in a brand new way. So there's such a wonderful a paradox there. It's, well, or something like where you have a chord progression, say in jazz, where there's a lot of improvisation over a
Mhm.
bass chord structure. It's that kind of
Right.
energy with
Yeah,
what,
and still grounded in the structure, which
absolute,
is, yeah.
and formally very, and they're doing difficult things like the it's not easy to accomplish that, but it needs to sound effortless and be easy, or
Right.
seem easy to the reader. So I think of form as kind of a, like beautiful architecture, or this classically formed ancient vase.
Mhm.
Something has it's elevated it into the form of art, and it stands there alone in its structure, and all of the sensory elements, as well as its meaning. And so I think that form offers that. There's this timelessness, and I think it's worth the effort. I think it's worth the
Mhm.
effort for those reasons. So like I said, I found it increasingly beneficial, and I have been working on refining my craft and my ability to work with meter over time. So I'm not quite there yet, but I'm still working on it.
Mhm. Yeah. So did you start out as a poet kind of writing more in formal verse, or did you kind of have a shift from free verse to formal verse as you matured?
you know, I I had forgotten about this, but in high school, my our a teacher, senior year, my English teacher said we learned about sonnets. And I remember her saying, I was going to have you write sonnets, but I realized how hard they are. And so instead, we're
Mhm.
just going to do this other thing, maybe a few lines or something. And that stuck with me, that it was too hard to do, and
Mhm.
so one of the poems that I remember writing in college, one of my early poems, was a sonnet. It's like I always wanted to do it. And so for a few years I'm going to write that sonnet. I'm going to write that sonnet. And I did. I wrote one. And so I was writing in a formal structure from my earliest kind of once I was old enough, and once I learned about it, I was
Mhm.
writing in with a form. And then I think I tapped back into, like, again, those old, Longfellow poems. And so it was already kind of, it was in me. I had that. And I also have a little bit of a musical background as well,
Mhm.
and choir. And so I think the rhythms and I think it's easier if you have some musical background than
Yeah.
not. Um, so that's probably, so I know that I started doing it, but I a lot of my earlier work was free verse, because I loved, modern writers who did not write in verse until I thought free verse was in style, and that, so I was going to do style, and I didn't want to be old fashioned. What a mistaken idea.
Mhm. Right. Yeah, I've noticed, well, maybe it's just because I'm being more introduced to this field, but at least at least from my perspective, I see a shift back to older forms among poets now. Have you noticed the same, or do you think that that's perhaps me just reading into it?
I don't know. I'm so steeped in it now that I'm around it all the time, and the people I know. I mean, I know a lot of people who are just starting out with it, and so I know that it's not everywhere, but I know so many people writing in form now that I feel like it must be resurging a little bit.
Yeah.
And um and again, I don't I still like free verse poems, and I don't have any problem with them. And I don't mean to, kind of knock them, because I've written a lot of free verse and will, I'm sure, again, but
Mhm.
there is more of an openness to, craftsmanship than I think there has been for a while.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't mean not free verse either. I guess I would put it more as like there's been a rediscovery or something of what these traditional forms can do poetically for your voice. So at least that's an observation from an editor. So
There were the new formalists a few decades back who
yeah,
kind of researched a little then, and then I think it dipped down again. And I agree with you. I think that it might be having a resurgence right now.
yeah. What was Robert Frost one of the new formalists, if you know offhand?
He was earlier.
Earlier. Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you've received just a ton of accolades in your poetry career so far. As you've only been doing this for a few years now, right? Publishing. Um,
Yeah, I started sending things out around maybe like 2011. So
okay,
maybe started out a decade ago, just with little pieces here and there, and the chapbook got published in 2020. So
right.
that's a couple of years.
Yeah, no, that's pretty short time to get the recognition that you have. Calling the Garden again, it placed in second in the Books of Creative Verse in the National Federation of Press Women 2021 Communications Contest. And then he received the Lucille Johnston Clark Memorial Award from Houston Poetry Fest in 2019. It's a lot of ground to cover in the couple years. So what has it just been like for you to be nationally recognized as a poet like that?
Thank you for that. That's so kind. It's so gracious of you. I feel like poetry is about connecting our inner lives with the inner lives of others.
Hmm.
And so if we think about somebody like Emily Dickinson, who wrote for herself, she didn't share her work, and it, so later on we're blessed to be able to read it, but she wasn't really writing for others to read it necessarily, for publication or anything like that. But like, look at what we would be missing out on if we did not have those poems and that window into her rich imaginative life. Poetry is meant to be a connection and to be spoken
Mhm.
out and the world and heard and received, and to connect us. So recognition like that you're talking about, it lets me know that someone's receiving that gift that I'm
Mhm.
sending out,
Mhm.
and that they're in some way connecting with it, and somebody is, and then that just tells me to keep working at it.
Mhm.
It's a great gift back to me. It's a little communication back saying, yeah, go ahead and keep doing this, keep following that calling. So that's how I see it.
Mhm.
Kind of a little
Right. And not just from other people, but also hopefully from the Lord. So
Mhm.
yeah.
That's right.
Well, if you could just tell yourself, your younger self, I mean, one thing now that you have that you know as an experienced poet, what would that be?
My younger self, I would say, if you want your work to bear meaningful fruit, you need to plant your life, your writing life, in the soil of gratitude and wonder.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's what
Well, what practical advice would you give to aspiring Christian poets, just like places to submit, how to get exposure, all that?
I would say, start small. First of all, I started with haiku journals, so
Mhm.
find small journals that are looking to kind of get a start, and look at their guidelines, and you look at poets that you admire, and you see where they have been published. You look at some of their earlier work, and some of the earlier places they were published. Where were they starting out? And you follow the trail, and then you go from there. That's how you
Right.
discover different places. You should welcome rejection. No is an acronym for next opportunity. Fail is an acronym for first attempt at learning, as they say. Gotta get ready. You gotta, yes, great. Welcome that rejection. It's a numbers game. I think it's important to learn poetic craft, learn about the tradition, and learn what came before, so that you're conversing with poets throughout time, not just, this little small circle of the poets that happen to be alive right now, this little moment that's tiny. The whole thing about writing is that you get to write to people down the line, and you want to listen to what the earlier poets said as well. I think it's important to find wise and accomplished mentors, mentors, not just any mentor. You should connect with fellow creative people, creative writers. Workshop your writing, but don't let workshop comments stifle your inner creative charism. Read voraciously and widely. Work on tuning your ear to the divine music. Write as a gift of self. Give of yourself when you write. I think it's important to pursue projects with eyes wide open. Reflect on your motivation before you take on something. Why do you want this? Is that a worthy motivation, and a good motivation? And then be realistic about the time commitments, and be realistic about writing life needs to be a little boring. You got to get in there and write, have quiet time. So it's not what you see on the outside. It's a lot of interior time and quiet time. And then lastly, I would say you need to protect that creative time and that alone time. But as a Christian writer, I don't always believe in, I think it's important to protect it. But when there's something important that you need to sacrifice it for, I think you need to sacrifice it. Like if somebody needs something, it really truly needs you, and you need to be there, then because that's what we always have to balance as mothers, writers who are parents have to balance the need of their families. And for me, my students and my colleagues and all those, so I think that that's important to balance and to reflect on and be mindful about. And then pray about it and choose the balance that gives the greatest glory to God.
Yeah, no, I really love the point about motivation as well. Because it is, I think that Matt Andrews, one of our prior guests and now our poetry editor, he made the point of writing can be a spiritual discipline. And in that way, it's kind of part of your sanctification, which is just growing closer to God. So I do think that everything that we do, not just out in our daily lives, but also in writing, that is subsumed under the Christian worldview and needs to be questioned, just like any other motivation that we have, whether to date this person or to take this job or so on and so forth. So I really do appreciate that point. Well, closing out then, Lesley, why don't you just read us some of your poems?
Wonderful. Well, do you want me to start with Cassiopeia, since that's the one that
Sure, a little bit of shameless self-promotion for us.
Wonderful. Thank you for taking this poem and giving it a home. Cassiopeia A, circa 1690. The light from the supernova has just reached Earth. 10,000 years ago, the neon rush of hydrogen expanded. Lavender and shock white formed in spectral web and dust. It swept up space debris in widening clouds that now and many generations hence will radiate 100,000 times our sun's ignoble energy. Asleep, snug in the glow, there floats an infant star. As ruddy arrogance is sometimes stripped away by rival arrogance, so this red giant tore away the other's skin. An envelope of hydrogen, we'll learn some centuries from now. This violence bore all the gravity of insult, fed and pressurized. The fighter's stance of these two stars led to a grand finale loosed in shockwave with a flash of insight, late learned hamartia on a solar scale. Who sees the smudge of light for what it is? One amateur stargazing fool. The odds of witnessing a reckoning like this are minuscule, The learned astronomers were dozing while this putterer, with tired and star-strained eye, chanced on the gruesome fall, the supernova of the fiery queen, whose might had once seemed unassailable. How rarely we discern what's happening the moment of the star's collapse. We miss the trident strike that hurls the proud queen deep into the sky, enthroned but bound to wheel around the north celestial pole and cling tight, hanging upside down through half the year. Fate will judiciously seize fire from one and dole it out to others, leaving naught of the progenitor except that dense core known as shame. But too, new life, as here, the infant neutron star tucked warmly in its mist of carbon, lost in guiltless dreams.
I've got to say too, I really love your reading voice. It's so calming. Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. How about Graceless now?
Okay, Graceless. Before the surge of gravity, a heady urge wells up to turn, to claw the wet, loose graveled ledge and scramble back onto its lap. The air hums, taut with shouting from the local kids who've sailed this cliff all morning, all their lives, in fact, their dives inscribing splendid arcs that curve like lavender in wind. We find our jumper in midair for just a fraction of a blink, 2 mere abysmal feet beyond the cliff, beneath the aqueducts that have for ages leashed the sky with pitiless gymnastic grace. A high relief of gangliness, her fingers splayed, her elbows all rough angles, failing to achieve with even happenstance good luck some form that might result in a smooth meeting with the water far below. We meet her thus in sight of tourists and bronze locals, dwarfed by architectural finesse. Poor victim of glass half full whim, smacked by the risk and risk reward, and dubbed postmodern poster child for acute onset second thought.
Very good. All right, and then I think we have the Cathedral Sees Morning.
Well, the last one in the chapbook, and that's where the chapbook gets its name. The Cathedral Sees Morning. Her saints' faces flayed long ago. The molasse bell on the near bank bears the past like a brittle scroll. Certain blocks high in her facade seek daylight with empty sockets, remnants of a graveyard past carved by Gallo-Roman hands, so that on ancestral days the living could break wine-soaked bread with the dead. It must have been a hopeful act to lift those stones up heavenward, for this is no mausoleum. Webbed windows, ash-gray from without, blazon gem-bright stories within. Through the triumphs and agonies, dawn reaches into the hushed space, where mea culpas flicker up alcove walls. Bouquet rays gather at the knees of the found, petaled in hair on folds of clothes, calling the garden up out of the grave.
Yeah, I love that one. Well, Lesley, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. I really appreciate your coming on and just your time. And I pray for the continued success of your work. So thank you again.
Really, thank you a bunch.
All right. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.